it is a privilege to be here, and it's a delight to be back on Chapel Hill's campus, and to get more than a few hours at a time to just do ancient space and place, which is great. So thank you all for helping make that happen. So I am going to attempt to interact with you at a couple of points during the talk. If at all possible, please humor these attempts, and if you can, meet me halfway. That'd be super great. So we'll start right out of the box and say, how many of you are familiar with Joe Goldie's online essay on the spatial turn in Western scholarship? Anybody?
From the AHR?
Sorry?
Where was it? Was it in the AHR?
No, it's just an online essay. She may have done some other stuff in other locations. This is obviously an area of interest for her. But now this is an essay that I would highly recommend that she published in 2011 as sort of a framing essay or a framing narrative for something called the Spatial Humanities website. This was a publication of the Scholars Lab at the University of Virginia, and the website was created partly to serve as a record of the NEH-funded Institute for Enabling Geospatial Scholarship. This institute was actually a series of 3 different thematic sessions that were like a week in length each, I think, and they were hosted by the Scholars Lab in 2009 and 2010. So she had written the thing earlier for them, but it all actually appeared on the web in 2011 after the fact. But I want to give you a little quote from it, because this idea of the spatial turn is going to be my launching pad for the talk. She says, landscape turns and spatial turns are referred to throughout the academic disciplines, often with reference to GIS and the neo-geography revolution. By turning, we propose a backwards glance at the reasons why travelers from so many disciplines came to be here, fixated upon landscape together. For the broader questions of landscape, worldview, palimpsest, the commons and community, panopticism, and territoriality are older than GIS. Their stories rooted in the foundations of the modern disciplines. These terms have their origin in a historic conversation about land use and agency. Professor Goldie's essay then takes us on a journey through the halls of the academy. We visit several departments, several disciplines. Among them, anthropology, sociology, psychology. History does not escape. And she traces the intellectual innovations and the responses to them that iteratively give rise to many of the same kinds of research questions and methods that we're going to be talking about this weekend. Springing, as they did originally, from sort of regard of the rise of the nation state and trying to understand and react to its implications, but then factored through the other concerns of the academy, the other interests of these academic disciplines. So I don't think it's a stretch to say that not only our conference, but its direct antecedents and its siblings. So the Mapping Center, its projects, the Barrington Atlas, its inheritors, they're all on some level symptoms of this spatial turn, which we really should think of, I think, as a series of backwards glances at space and place and what it means to us, each time informed by the methods and the technologies available to us. All right, so we got the theory out of the way. What's the point of my talk? Well, frankly, I really just want to ask, to what degree do we, and I mean we as representatives of people engaged in spatial practice in the past-oriented humanities, to what degree do we know what we're doing? So, for example, if I said, is spatial practice a subfield, would you have an answer for me? Is it a methodology? It's pretty clear that it spans chairs in the academy, right? We've got a lot of interdisciplinary going on. There are people using the same methods in lots of fields. But does it answer better or uniquely a particular kind of research question? Is spatial inquiry a standard competency in the humanities, or should it remain the domain of specialists? Back to the subfield question, as posed in a different way. Does it inform or demand a specialized pedagogy? Within ancient studies in particular, have we placed spatially informed scholarship into a stable orbit, one that we can describe and maintain? Or are we still bumping and bouncing around in an unruly atmosphere trying to figure out whether we should land or stay in the air? Some of you will probably recognize in this framework some of the questions, or maybe the better word is anxieties, that are very much alive for the digital humanities. The two domains are not disjoint. Spatial analysis and visualization are core DH competencies. I think anybody who does DH would say, yes, spatial. I may not do it, but spatial is part and parcel of DH. The fact that the Scholars Lab proposal proposed and the NEH Office of Digital Humanities funded that series of institutes I was talking about is just sort of underlines the point. So when it comes to spatial analysis and visualization, what are our primary objects of interest? Everybody should say location. If you go over to wherever the geographers are now and you don't say location to the GIS guys as being like the fundamental thing, you get in trouble. Location and relative location are obviously important because they're variables in almost every equation we can care about if space matters to us at all. Humans are physical beings, and almost all of our technology and all of our interaction, even in the digital age, is enabled and constrained by physical factors that vary not just in time, but in three-dimensional space. So if we can locate people, places, and things in space, whether we can do it absolutely or relatively, so relative to each other, then we can open up our spatial toolkit and start doing stuff. Our opportunities to explore can become even richer when we can access the way ancient people seem to have located themselves, located each other, located places and things in space, and the rhetoric and language that they used to describe and depict those locations. The connections between places and between places and other things are also important, right? The related things can be of any imaginable type. Objects, dates, events, people, themes. We can express and investigate these relationships with a variety of spatial and non-spatial information structures. Directed graphs, networks, just to name a couple of examples. There are digital tools and methods at our disposal for working with these mental constructs too. And we'll touch on a couple in a minute, but I'd like the research questions rather than methods to lead the discussion. When looking at both built and exploited natural landscapes, we're often interested in the functions humans impart to space and place. But these observations apply not only to physical environments, but also to their descriptions in literature, their depictions in art and cartography, and so on. And so, a discussion about spatial function is also about spatial rhetoric and about performance, audience, and reception of that rhetoric. So allow me a brief example. The sanctuary of Artemis Limnatis at Limnos in the Tigris Mountains. Its location is demonstrated today only by scattered architectural, artistic, and epigraphic remains, but epigraphic and literary testimony make it clear that it was just one of several such sanctuaries devoted to the same goddess that operated at various periods and places in Peloponnese, some of them contemporaneously. Was this ancient place of worship located in a beautiful spot, as we tend to think Greek temples are? And did that somehow evoke the divine for people who visited the temple? Sure, I mean, it must have. But it and its homonymous siblings also existed to claim, mark, guard, consecrate, and celebrate political and economic assertions about the land it overlooked. She's Artemis of the borders. Consequently, the sanctuary was a locus of civic pride for the Messenians and the Spartans, those old buddies. So, from legendary times down to at least the reign of Vespasian, it looks like it occasioned both bloodshed and elite competition for the favor of whatever imperial power was in the ascendancy at the time. Given the goddess's epithet, Limnatis, the sanctuary's location, and its history of contentiousness, I don't think we can be surprised that a writer like Tacitus should take notice when delegations from both sides show up in Rome to argue for either the maintenance of or the reversal of the last decision about whose sanctuary it is. I'm sorry. I can't help but imagining Tacitus smirks as he drops it into the text of his annals, entirely an indirect discourse for you Latinists in the crowd, and deliberately ambiguous, of course, about whether the audience was heard by the emperor or the Senate. I mean, he just had to get a huge kick out of that, because here he's got, you know, a notable event of the year in the annals style. He can talk about it. It's, you know, substantive of its own accord. But it also is this perfect metaphor for the estrangement of emperor and senate, for the clash between new power and old prerogatives. I mean, it's just a gem, right there. So I hope this kind of personally amusing example you know, points up what I'm trying to say about epigraphic and literary analysis, or documentary and literary analysis, that we can get insight into spatial function. And the thing is, computational methods can also be used for this purpose. The two approaches are complementary. We didn't need it for the Artemis Limnatus one, but sometimes, depending on the data and the question, you'll find that a computational approach and a close reading approach will complement each other. They'll fill in gaps one for another, but other times it'll only be the one that is mostly useful in a particular case, as the close human reading was in this case. Let's talk about some of the computational methods. A couple of weeks ago, I got to spend some time talking to Lisa Mignone at Brown about her innovative work on the visibility of temples in Rome with respect to the valley of the Tiber. So if you're on the Tiber, what do you see? And to the approaches, the main approaches to Rome. And she's mainly, I think, looking at Republican era temple foundations and hills. Nobody here, I think, is going to try to argue that among the factors at play in the siting of temples during Rome's expansion during the Republic includes demonstrations of control and power. I mean, visual rhetoric. I think we could probably all get behind that idea. If you want to be convinced, mutatis mutandis, just go walk the Tiber at length today. You're not going to see the same stuff, but you're going to see the same kind of stuff. And if you don't want to go all the way to Rome tomorrow, you can go out on McCorkle Place and inspect all the sight lines to monuments and buildings with particular functions, like libraries and post offices and things. You know, don't miss Silent Sam. And you're going to see a visual and spatial rhetoric at work in this space. So, in any case, you can't just turn computers loose on this, right? The mind of the researcher has always got to be involved in interpretation, in evaluation, in narration of the findings, in argument. And the researcher is going to need to be informed as much as possible by the history and the archaeology and so on of what they're working on. But depending on the scale and the alterations that a particular landscape has undergone over time, sometimes you absolutely need to use viewshed analysis, probably backed up by some amount of topographic reconstruction. Viewsheds are determined by assessing the visibility of every point in an area from a particular point of interest. Can I see the University Arboretum from the north-facing windows of the Ancient World Mapping Center office on the 5th floor of Davis Library? Some of you who have been there know, yes, I can. The Arboretum, or at least parts of it, are in the viewshed of the Ancient World Mapping Center windows. Is the pit, where we party and preach and all that stuff, in the viewshed of those windows? No, mercifully it's not. And it's not in the earshed either most of the time, which is great. In one methodological aspect, Professor Mignone's work is not new. Viewshed analysis has been widely used for years in archaeological and historical study at levels ranging from the house to the public square to the civic territory and that sort of thing. I don't think anybody could enumerate all the published reports and use cases and analyses that take advantage of viewshed analysis in the humanities or even in ancient studies without doing a couple years of bibliographic work. I mean, I think it's that ubiquitous, lurking behind that many things. But I do want to mention one of the most well-known, or maybe most accessible, if you'll permit me a brief excursion outside the field of ancient studies. And this is Ann Kelly Knowles' work with multiple collaborators on the Battle of Gettysburg. And the basic question is, what could the commander see, and when could they see it? This is not a new question. If you study the Civil War and you study Gettysburg, you know that's like the main question. What could Lee see? And then when he couldn't, given what he could and couldn't probably see, why did he do what he did? What Anne and her team did is they went back and systematically examined exactly what each of these guys could have seen at each moment based on all the information we have. And it doesn't change the overall tenor of our understanding that Lee was hopelessly uninformed, but it does provide quite a lot of information about how badly he was informed and how well informed certain Union generals were at particular times. There's a really nice interactive presentation of the data and some of the conclusions on the Smithsonian Magazine website that I encourage you to look at. It's also just a lot of fun to play with if you can ignore the underlying horror of what it's actually about. Off the top of my head, if we want to come back to ancient studies, I can point to a couple of other examples, but I think it's only going to scratch the surface, right? There's 2004, Andrew Sherratt did a nice, short, accessible thing on Mycenae, which explores the site's sort of visual and topographic advantages, and it's done in a very accessible online way on the Arch Atlas website, with nice short narration. It's a really kind of accessible introduction to the thing without getting into how it's done, just the results and the visuals. There was also a poster that Jim Newhart and several collaborators presented at the 2012 meeting of the Archaeological Institute of America. And it reported on their use of viewshed analysis and some other methods as part of an integrated approach to identifying Byzantine fortifications in a particular part of Anatolia. And the idea here was that the presence of a certain kind of viewshed, so one that seemed to offer an advantage for surveillance of strategically useful landscape components like valleys and passes and this sort of thing, a site having such a viewshed might offer credence to the idea that the function of that, or that a main function of that particular built feature was surveillance, was a fortification or a watchtower or something like this. So here we are looking at viewsheds not only being revelatory, but predictive, and possibly useful in doing taxonomy for analysis. And in our very own conference, we'll hear from Morgan DeRodi and Maria Copascelli about their use of viewshed analysis. So are they here tonight? No? Shoot.
A very long flight.
I imagine. And other techniques to refine the understanding of multiple archaeological sites in northwest Greece. So we're going to get to see viewsheds in action tomorrow. We're just gonna like most forms of computational spatial analysis, viewshed work is most rigorously and uniformly accomplished with GIS software, supplied with appropriately scaled location and elevation data. To do it reliably by hand for probably any interesting case would be ridiculously impossible and fraught with peril. So these dependencies on software and data and the applied know-how to use them effectively should draw our attention to some important facts, I think. First of all, assembling the prerequisites of non-trivial spatial analysis is challenging and time-consuming. More than once, I've heard Professor Knowles say something like 90% of the time and effort in a historical GIS project goes into data collection and preparation. Just as we depend on the labor of librarians, editors, philologists, Renaissance humanists, medieval copyists, and their allies for the ability to leverage the ancient literary tradition for scholarly work, so too we depend on the labor of mathematicians, geographers, cartographers, programmers, surveyors, and their allies for the data and computational artifice we need to conduct viewshed analysis. This inescapable debt, or if you prefer, this vast interdisciplinary contribution to our work or investment in our work, framework is a topic I'd like to return to at the end of the talk, as we're trying to figure out whether we're bumpy or smooth. Before we turn our gaze to other methods, I'd like to talk briefly about other kinds of sheds. No, Ryan, I'm not going to talk about the woodshed, you're safe. Watershed analysis, which is the business of calculating an entire area drained and or supplied by a particular water system, whether it's natural or man-made, is a well-established method of physical geography and the inspiration for the name viewshed. It has value for cultural, economic, and historical study too, and so we got to keep it on our spatial antiquity radar. In fact, Melissa Huber, is Melissa here? Hi, Melissa. Melissa Huber is going to talk about the Roman water infrastructure under Claudius, and I gather you're going to showcase this very method. Is that right? At least along the way. Yes. Awesome. Okay. At any point, because you may have gathered by now, we'll talk about everybody's paper, and when I mischaracterize your paper, please jump me. Don't let it go by. So I'm just reading the abstract and reading in my own biases. We mentioned Sarah Bond earlier. Well, among her current research ideas is a smells map of ancient Rome. Where in the streets of ancient Rome would you have encountered the odors of a bakery, or a latrine, or a Phalonica? God help you, what would it have smelled like? Which, this idea gets me wondering, will it be possible at some point to integrate dynamic airflow models and prevailing wind models with urban topography and location data and let us create smell sheds or nosescapes? Really hope so. Sound sheds ought to be another interesting possibility. Right? We ought to look for leadership to work with people like Paul Vetch, who's investigating acoustics and architecture at Ostia. If you want to hear Johnny Cash played in various rooms of a Roman bath and what the acoustics of the room does to Johnny Cash in each of those different spaces, check out his website. And then right here in the triangle, the virtual Paul's Cross project at NC State has been doing very interesting stuff with the modeling of acoustic performance in particular spaces. And I think there's spatial aspects to a lot of this stuff that we may see eventually getting to be interesting for trying to access what ancient life is like. So every bit as interesting, I hope, as what the ancients could see and from where they could see it is the question of how they saw things. How they saw things in space and how they described them. Our curiosity about ancient geographic mental models and worldview drives us to ask questions like the ones Richard has been asking. Did the people living in a Roman province think of themselves as of the province in the way some modern Americans would say, I'm an Alabamian or a Michigander or a North Carolinian? Were the Roman provinces strictly administrative in nature, or did they actually contribute to some element of personal or corporate identity? That's not a field that has to be plowed exclusively with computers, right, Richard? Mm-hmm. But questions of ancient worldview do sometimes lend themselves to computational approaches as well. So let's consider, for example, the work of Elton Barker and his colleagues under the rubric of the Hestia project. Here's how they describe it. Using the digital text of Herodotus' histories, Hestia uses web mapping technologies such as GIS, Google Earth, and the narrative time map to investigate the cultural geography of the ancient world through the eyes of one of its first witnesses, that is, Herodotus himself. So in Hestia, one of the things they do, word collocation, which is a mainstay of computational text analysis, what words appear close to other words, is brought together and integrated with location-based measures to interrogate not only the spatial proximity of the places mentioned by Herodotus, but also the textual proximities of those mentions. So with these keys, the Hestia team is able to unlock the door to Herodotus' geo-mind, right? And maybe to some extent that of the culture he lived in. You can ask questions like, what combinations of actual location, historical events, cultural assumptions, and literary agenda might have shaped the co-mentioning of certain places in a particular piece of his narrative? Why is this place and that place talked about at the same time? He doesn't just keep us all hyper-local as we move through his narrative. Hestia is not alone in exploring this particular frontier. Tomorrow we're going to hear from Ryan Horn about his collaborative work on the Big Ancient Mediterranean project. As I understand it, among its pioneering aspects is the incorporation of data about more than the collocation of place names in primary sources and the relationships of those reference names with each other. BAM is also trying, as I understand it, to scrutinize personal names and the historical persons to whom they refer and relate that to the spatial and textual. So, who is mentioned with whom where? What can we learn from exploring the networks of connections that radiate from those kind of intersections? Then he uses the wrong key. Sorry about that, folks. Right. So the introduction of a temporal axis into geospatial calculation and visualization is also usually necessary and instructive in spatial ancient studies, even if that still proves to be harder than it should be in conventional GIS software. So Amanda Coles, who I think is not yet here also, is that right? Yeah. Well, her abstract, as I read it, she has taken on that challenge of bringing time into the GIS, and is going to be telling more about how it's helped her to learn about the interplay between warfare, colonial foundations, road building, and Roman elites and their agendas during the Republic. So that should be a really interesting talk. View sheds, worldviews, and temporality. Okay, we've got three monsters now, right? How about spatial economies? Let's add a fourth. How close were sources of production to their markets? How close in terms of distance? How close in terms of travel time? How close in terms of cost to move goods? Maybe we're interested in urban logistics. How quickly could you empty the Colosseum of people? Maybe that's trivia. How much bread could you distribute to how many people in a particular amount of time at a particular place? What were the constraints and capacities for transport of the raw materials for that bread? What do the answers to such questions reveal about the practicality, ubiquity, purpose, social reach, and costs of communal activities in the public space? How do these conclusions square with the representation and critiques voiced in ancient sources? How long would it take a legion to move from one place to another in a particular landscape? What happens when we compare the effects of landscape on travel time with the built architecture of the limes, or the information we can glean about unit deployment patterns from military documents like the Vindolanda tablets or the ostraca from Boot Gym? The computational methods involved in these sorts of investigations have wonderful names. I love them. And like the others we've discussed, they require spatial algorithms realized in specialized software, GIS or something like it. Consider cost surfaces. For a particular unit of area on the ground, what is the cost in time or effort to pass through? Consider network cost models. For specific paths between nodal points, what is the cost of transit? This is mainly about how you represent your cost model. Do you do it in a gridded structure, or do you do it in a number structure? Consider least cost path analysis. Given a cost surface or a network model, what's the cheapest path available between 2 points of interest? Many classicists will have used Orbis, the Stanford geospatial network model of the Roman world. The Orbis team, assembled by Walter Scheidel, has produced an online environment in which one can query a network model of travel costs between key nodal points in the Roman world, varying such parameters as time of year and mode of transportation. This model and its digital modes of access bring us to another vantage point. How close were two places in the Roman world, not as the crow flies, not in terms of miles along a road, but as the boat sailed or the feet walked. Barbara Weissova is going to talk to us tomorrow about her work in and around Nicaea. Is Barbara here? Hi, Barbara. Welcome. Among her results, if I read your abstract correctly, you're going to be discussing another application of least cost path analysis. You're going to help us figure out where a particular road might have been, or some roads. Yeah, great. So, least cost path analysis. It's not just about travel, transport, and cost. Distribution patterns are of interest too, often combined with ceramic analysis or various forms of isotopic or metallurgical testing. And with it, we can assess the origin, dissemination, and implications of ancient objects as they are found in groups and patterns in the landscape. inscriptions, coins, portable antiquities, architectural and artistic styles and components, pottery. All of these have been used in studies that look at distribution and origin and deposit. I think Corey Ellithorpe, is Corey here? Hey, Corey. Hi. Corey's going to give us a taste of this approach in numismatics, right? So you're going to look at Roman imperial ideology and regional coin distribution patterns. Very cool. So that's going to be interesting. All right, I've mentioned several of the papers now, so I'm going to pause for a second. And I really want to express my hope that you're going to agree with the following statement. I think we're in for a big treat tomorrow. I'm really excited. It's going to be an intellectual feast. And I think now is as good a time as any to congratulate the organizers on putting together a tremendous program. Yeah. And also, I think we need to congratulate all the people who submitted abstracts and who've gone to the trouble to be here. So that's because it's good. If we want to get back to the question of do we know what we're doing as a field or a subfield or a community of practice, the fact that these papers are all so good and interesting and varied must be something we should consider in that analysis, right? Assiduous students of the conference program aren't going to notice, however, I haven't mentioned everybody yet. Don't fear, I have another section to my talk. Can't escape yet. And this section of the talk requires me to borrow a phrase from Megan Trainor. It's all about that data. Conference presenters, this question's for you. Would you agree with the dictum I attributed earlier to Ann Knowles? Does data collection and preparation take up a huge chunk of your time? Yes. Spatial data, particularly spatial data for ancient studies, doesn't grow on trees, come in a jar, or sit on a shelf. The ingredients have to be gathered and cleaned, combined and cooked, and then you have to take care of it, transport it, keep track of it, and refashion it to fit your software and your questions. Sometimes you have to start over. You have to hunt down additional ingredients or try a new recipe. This sort of iterative work, the cyclic remaking of the experimental apparatus and the materials, is absolutely fundamental to spatially informed research in ancient studies. It's integral. If you were hoping that I was going to grind an axe at some point during this talk, yes, it's time. It's axe grinding time. There's absolutely no question in my mind that the collection and curation of data is part and parcel of research. It is a research activity. It has research outcomes. You can't answer questions without it. If you aren't surfacing your work on data creation in your CV, or if you're discounting someone else's work on data creation and curation in decisions about hiring, tenure, and promotion, I have an old Bob Dylan song to play for you. Archive and publish your data sets. Treat them as publications in your CV. Write a review, which implies you have to get it out and use it, of somebody else's published data set and try to get it published. Document your data creation process in articles and conference presentations. Yes, I am stirring the pot. Okay, axe is down. Where does all this data come from? Sometimes we can get some of it in prepared form, even if subsequent selection and reformatting is required. For some areas and scales, modern topography and elevation can be had in various raster and vector formats. You know, if you need a relatively straightforward outline of modern countries, or even countries at certain relatively recent historical periods. That's, you know, out there ubiquitously for the taking, digital elevation models and stuff like that. There's also some specialized data sets that can be used as a springboard for some tasks, and it's here that the Pleiades project that I direct seeks to contribute. By digitizing not the maps from the Barrington Atlas, but the places and place names referenced on those maps and in the map-by-map directory, we created a digital data set with potential for wide reuse. By wrapping that in a software framework that facilitates discovery, display, some basic cartographic visualization, and collaborative updates, we were able to break out of the constraints of scale and cartographic economy that were imposed by the paper atlas format. So Pleiades now knows many more places than the Barrington did. A bunch of those are outside the cultures that the Barrington treated, but increasingly they are also at scales below that the Barrington treated. So monuments within settlements, these kinds of things. We've also seen more precise coordinates coming into. Barrington Atlas maps are limited on scale. A dot on that map is about 2 kilometers on the Earth's surface. We would like more precise coordinates now that we have access to data that makes that easier to come by. So all of this data is built for use. You can collect it piece by piece from the web interface yourself, or you can download it en masse in a number of formats. You can even write programs to talk directly to Pleiades for you, requesting and receiving data in a computationally actionable form. The Mapping Center has data for reuse too, I think including historical coastlines and rivers and some kinds of map-based materials, and that's all downloadable in GIS-friendly formats. But Pleiades and the Mapping Center only help for some things. I think it's telling that as far as I could discern from the abstracts, there are only a couple of projects to be presented here at the conference that made use of Pleiades data at all. And that's not because Pleiades is bad, and it's not because the authors didn't know about Pleiades. It's because the questions they're asking require a different kind of data entirely. It's just apples and oranges. That's proof of the point I'd like to underline. Usually, because your research question is unique, because you wouldn't be doing it otherwise if it weren't unique, you're going to have to get your hands dirty with data collection. Back to my earlier rant. Before we get dirty, I'm obliged to point out that although Pleiades has received significant periodic support from the National Endowment for Humanity since 2006, the views, findings, conclusions, and recommendations expressed in this lecture do not necessarily reflect those of the National Endowment. We've already touched on the presence of spatial language in literature. For some studies, the place names, placeful descriptions, and narratives of place and space found in both primary and secondary sources constitute raw data we like to use. Identifying and extracting such data is usually a non-trivial task for a text or corpus of any length, and it may involve a combination of manual and computational techniques. It's here we can encounter geoparsing as a term of art, as established methods in natural language processing and named entity recognition are brought to bear on a corpus of texts. Many digital textual projects are anticipating this need, and they're either doing the geoparsing for you or actually equipping their editions with spatial annotations. Among the kinds of projects that are doing this are any number of documentary ones for papyri and epigraphy that use the Epidoc encoding scheme. The Perseus Digital Library does this. The Pelagios Commons, by way of its Recogito platform, is doing a combination of first programmatic geoparsing and then human supervised cleanup. The China Historical GIS is an interesting case because it's built, the GIS itself is built entirely from textual sources. So there's not a place name or an assertion about a relationship between two places in the GIS that doesn't come from a particular source attestation. It's the sources that actually drive the creation of an entity in the GIS data set. Now for your project, you may be able to find geoparsed digital texts that serve your needs, or you may need to do the work yourself. Either way, some transformation on the results of the geoparsing is likely to be necessary to make them useful in the context of your research question. Right? There's no free lunch. And I think relevant here on some level is going to be Micah Meyer's paper, where you're going to talk about travel and the analysis and visualization of travel spatially, as travel is depicted in literature. Right? So as opposed to, I'm a historian, and so I know that the Alexandrian grain trade is important between Rome and Alexandria, so that's what I want to look at in Orbis. In your case, you want to know about a travel narrative in literature and unpacking. All right, if it's not literature, or if literature is not enough, maybe just geophysical and archaeological survey is what you're after. You may have to do fieldwork yourself, or maybe you can collect the information you need from prior publications, or get access to archival records and excavation databases that people have been keeping in floppy drives in their drawer. Or maybe you'll get lucky and find a data set that's been published into Open Context or the British Archaeological Data Service or TDAR, the Digital Archaeological Record or something like that. But using this data requires constant vigilance, especially when it was collected for some other scientific purpose than the one to which you were trying to put it. What were the sampling criteria? What sorts of material were intentionally ignored? What circumstances attend collection and post-processing? Sometimes the location data we need comes not from a single survey or excavation, but from a large number of possibly heterogeneous sources. This is going to be the case for many spatial studies that involve small finds, inscriptions, coins, that stuff. Fortunately, many major documentary, numismatic, and archaeological databases are working toward the inclusion of uniform geographic information in their database records. This development, which exploits the unique identifying numbers that Pleiades bestows on each ancient place, was first championed by Leif Isaacson, Elton Barker, and Rainer Simon of the Pelagius Commons project. If you get data from a project like the Heidelberg Epigraphic Data Bank, or Pyri.info, the Iraqi database of the German Archaeological Institute, online coins around the world, or Perseus, you can count on being able to join that data easily with Pleiades data and with data from other Pelagius partners, provided what you want to join them on is geography. Hopefully, this will save some people some time, someday. There's a lot of work going into it in a lot of places right now. But sometimes what's important from a prior survey is going to come to us primarily through maps and plans. Historical maps may carry information we'd like to extract and interpret. And this right here is an area where most of the digital humanities does most of its spatial work, is with historical maps. That's like the #1 thing you'll hear about at the DH conference or whatever, because they're much more ubiquitous for them than they are for us on one level. We don't have a ton of historical maps for ancient Greece. Now there is a whole raft of techniques associated with scanning and georegistering and geo this and georectification and geomorphing these maps so that they can be layered in a GIS and subjected to heads-up tracing or feature extraction or some kind of spatial algebra. Some historic cartefacts, so let's think about the Pottinger map, medieval map of Mundi, stuff that's closer to us. They're too out of step with our expectations about Cartesian uniformity to submit to these kind of mathematical solutions that are used on images of historical maps. So in this case, if you really want stuff off of there, recourse may be required to digitizing the features in the Cartesian plane of the image, and then getting your locations in spatial terms from somewhere else and applying that to the points or lines you pulled off of it. Digitizing and vectorizing plans and maps, though, not historical maps, but, well, modern historian might call them historical because they're from the 19th century, but we would call them secondary literature. That business of vectorizing those plans and maps, especially if they're resulting from multiple excavations or area surveys, that kind of thing. If your goal is to build up a particular data set or maybe an archaeological map of a region or a site, that necessitates not only GIS software, but very quickly you find yourself in a digital data management challenge because you're getting tons of files, different generations of things, derivative files and so on, and handling and preservation of that stuff can get pretty crazy. I think Tim Shea, is Tim here? Hi Tim. You're going to give us a tour, aren't you, of this for the Digital Athens project, where you've been building out an archaeological map of Athens piece by little piece. Let's not forget remote sensing. Any remote sensing fans in the room? Okay, a few shy ones. For those who are not familiar with it, I won't make you hold up your hand to say you're not familiar with remote sensing, I'm just going to lay this out there, and if I bore you, I'm sorry. In remote sensing, we use sensors. I must have written this part at dinner or something. Devices that gather information. Sensors are devices that gather information in various sections of the electromagnetic spectrum, or that detect change in local physical phenomena. We mount these sensors on platforms that let us take whatever point of view is necessary to achieve the resolution or scale or scope of interest that we're after. So satellites, airplanes, camels, drones, balloons, wagons, sleds, boats, carry them around, cameras are sensors. The sensors capture emitted and reflected light, maybe visible, infrared, and ultraviolet wavelengths, magnetic or electrical fields. Some of them are really cool, and they emit and detect the return of things like laser light or radio frequency energy or microwaves or millimeter waves, and especially for underwater archaeological applications, sound waves. Specialized software is used to analyze and convert such data for various purposes, often into rasterized, so gridded intensity or distance values that then can be visualized by assigning brightness and color scales to the values in the raster grid. So you get false color images, effectively, for interpreting it. Multiple images are often mosaicked together to form continuous images of a landscape or a 360-degree panorama or a inverted 360-degree panorama. Remotely sensed data facilitate the detection and interpretation of landforms, vegetation patterns, and physical change over time. So we reveal or enhance understanding of built structures and of exploited landscapes, and as well as conservation concerns. This is the sort of work that Sarah Parkek has been popularizing lately, but it too has decades of practice behind it. In 1990, Tom Seaver's dissertation reported on a remote sensing analysis of the Anasazi road system, revealing a component of the built landscape that was not only invisible on the ground, but that demonstrates that the Anasazi were far more willing even than the Romans to create ridiculously arrow straight roads despite the topography. The Romans were quite happy to use topography most of the time, unless they were making a big point. More recently, Seaver and his NASA colleague Daniel Irwin have been using remote sense data for parts of Guatemala, Honduras, and Mexico to distinguish between vegetation that thrives in alkaline soils and vegetation that doesn't. Because of the Mayan penchant for coating monumental structures with mass quantities of lime plaster, this data has proved remarkably effective in locating previously unknown structures beneath forest canopy. And as I understand, the results seem likely to overturn prevailing estimates of the extent of Mayan urbanism, illustrating a landscape that was much more thoroughly cleared and much more heavily built than current estimates. So given the passion with which I've already spoken about the caring and feeding of data, you'll be unsurprised to learn that I'm really looking forward to Nevio Danilon. Is Nevio here? Nevio's going to give a talk tomorrow on the capture and curation of remotely sensed data in a digital workflow. Yes. And that's all designed to support various kinds of visualization and VR, virtual reality environments. So that's going to be a really great talk. I do think it's worth noting that both Professor Parkek's recent collaborative work on this possible Viking settlement in Newfoundland, but also if we go back to Dr. Seaver's dissertation, these actually represent a certain common standard in the application of remote sensing to archaeology. I think that I have the impression that remote sensing methods or analysis is tried or adopted for most archaeological survey and excavation undertaken today in ancient studies. The choice of sensors, the platforms that are used, the analytical methods are going to vary. And they're going to vary in response to landscape conditions, presumed condition of preservation, money, time, all of those kinds of factors. But I think that that most archaeologists would tell you, if you're going to do more than some kind of little thing, if you're going to spend a lot of time in a survey area, several seasons, or on an excavation, you're going to want to have remote sensing of some kind. I think there's a similar common usage in archaeological projects for looking at geophysical and alluvial and climatic features of the site or the area. The data supporting those kinds of considerations is going to come from the same kinds of sources, but they might be geophysical maps or reports or studies rather than archaeological surveys or whatever. But they're going to look at them and you're going to work with them the same way. But I want to say, and maybe this is a hobby horse and not an axe to grind, but I think it's in this area, so ancient climate and landscape change, that ancient studies has a major deficit in procedure and data. I don't think it's at the level of the individual excavation or survey. But there is a ton of prior art in the computational predictive modeling of prior climate and landscape and ground cover, in geography and geophysics, in climate studies. This is a major, major area of work and has been for 10, 15, 20 years. But those kinds of approaches, to my knowledge, have only made it into our consideration of the ancient historical and near historical landscape in a very patchy and tentative way. I think there's been I don't know whether it's a disciplinary divide or whether it's this, same thing we did to Keith Hopkins when he started modeling the economy. Oh my God. But I think that's an area where we could stand to make an intervention and really begin to assess whether those methods could not be applied more aggressively to ancient studies. So there's a thing we could do. I'm about ready to conclude, but I think I'd be remiss if I didn't first zoom out a little bit from this kind of tight focus on research questions and talk a little bit about pedagogy and public engagement and outreach and cultural heritage preservation, because these are all actually right in there with the research tasks that people are engaged in. And in many individual projects, particularly archaeological field projects, they actually flow seamlessly to each other. You can't say this is research and this is outreach, except when you're writing to a particular funding body. So on the pedagogy and service to the field front, I do want to draw attention to the Ancient World Mapping Center's Antiquity a la carte application. This is a website that enables users to create and refine custom maps that are built on a combination of Pleiades and other data, so the map center's data is in there and so on. And the resulting maps, this is stuff Pleiades doesn't do. Resulting maps can then be cited by link, so you can get back to them later. You can download the data, so it's a mechanism for selecting data out of the giant soup that is Pleiades, 35,000 ancient places. You can control the labeling of the map. You can construct evil map quizzes for your students. All kinds of stuff like that. So that is an area of spatial practice in the humanities that that serves the researchers and serves research data. Well, and you could use it to prepare maps for a grant proposal or to communicate with colleagues. I mean, it's not confined to pedagogical use by any means. So I think that we really ought to keep those kinds of activities to creating cartographic communications that we share on the basis of data for various kinds of purposes are important. There's also a huge amount of work going on, part of governments and NGOs and academics, to try to bring all of the kinds of spatial methods we're talking about to bear on the problem of damage to cultural heritage sites. Whether the focus is on detection and assessment, or whether it's on raising public awareness, or whether it's on prevention and intervention, or maybe even someday war crimes. So the American Society for Oriental Research has a grant from the State Department to monitor site change in Iraq and Syria and report on what's happening based on satellite data and other information. There's an organization called the U.S. Committee of the Blue Shield that works with academics to prepare geospatial data sets that then are offered to the Department of Defense to communicate to the Department of Defense, here are the cultural sites that you ought to be concerned about if you engage in an intervention, because the United States is signatory to the Hague Convention for the protection of cultural property in the event of armed conflict. So above and beyond the moral question, there's international legal responsibility for U.S. forces, signatory nation forces, to respect and preserve the cultural heritage in an area where they're operating militarily. These are all critical undertakings. They are things that your colleagues are engaged in. Some of you may be engaged in some of them, or in analogous activities. And I think they also deserve to be considered right along with research, because they feed on research, they react to research, they support research when we talk about spatial antiquity. So how are we going to gather up all these threads in this discussion? Because we need to move on to the more substantive parts of the conference, like wine and conversation. A little bit of sleep before we listen to papers tomorrow. I think I'd like to conclude as I began by recommending an essay. Not the same one, although I still recommend that one. In this case, I'm thinking of Bethany Nowicki's recent essay on capacity and care in the digital humanities. Bethany's the former director of the UVA Scholars Lab, so these are the people who hosted that Geospatial Scholarship Institute and a whole bunch of other stuff. The Scholars Lab is a really important place, and Bethany's a really important person in the digital humanities. She's now serving as director of the Digital Library Federation at the Council on Library and Information Resources. I had the great good fortune to hear a version of this essay as a talk, as a keynote, at a meeting that was convened by the Office of Digital Humanities at the NEH back last fall. They were pulling together directors of currently grant-awarded projects, and Bethany gave a keynote for this. You can find it in its current form, because she's delivered it a couple times in different contexts and has sort of melded them together. You can find it on her personal website. Look for Bethany Nowicki. And I'm going to get around to posting references to everything I've talked about on my blog, so you'll be able to Google it later if you're interested. But Bethany thinks that humanities have some stuff to do. She thinks we need to expand the humanities' capacity in all sorts of ways, and that we need to do it kind of urgently, not only to survive the 21st century as a discipline, but to contribute usefully to its grand challenges, i.e., how do humans emerge from the 21st century? And one of the reasons that she feels that we need to do this is the increasing amount of data of every kind that's flooding our society and our academy and so on. And the accompanying desire for and need for data. I mean, we're all here talking about this kind of data to do this kind of spatial analysis and to answer this question I have about the age of gold. We want more data is being created. We want more data is being created. Are we at capacity? Can we expand to handle all that kind of data? What about moving gracefully in our analyses and in our representations and in our regard from large-scale, distant reading exercises with lots of computational aid to close reading and very fine-grained analysis? And can we connect those levels? Do we have the capacity and the methods to do that sort of thing? Do we have the capacity to address audiences and serve students in an expanding array of modes? We're coming at us from an expanding array of perspectives. Do we have the capacity to collaborate across disciplines and to heal structurally weakening divisions that already exist? For example, the division that has existed for a long, long time, especially in ancient studies, between faculty and alternate academics. Not necessarily enmity, but radically different class and privilege structures, radically different career arrangements. And can we do that even as the whole edifice of faculty promotion and tenure is flying apart under social and cultural pressure? What's Bethany's prescription? It's not a magic wand. It's actually hard work. It's an ethic of care. She defines that ethic of care as a set of practices rather than a precise methodological description. And she borrows a quotation from the political scientist Joan Tronta to kind of unpack that. An ethic of care is a species of collective activity that includes everything we do to maintain, contain, and repair our world or worlds so that we can live in it as well as possible. And we can substitute words in there all we want, right? To contain, maintain, and repair our practice, our academic work, our institutions, so that we can live and work and grow and learn in them and teach in them as well as possible. I think our practice of spatial humanities and ancient studies is just such a collaborative activity. I think we're already on the road. We don't have to turn around much to know that we're cradled in the arms and buoyed up on the shoulders of a vast cohort. I've already alluded to that, well, not alluded to it, yelled about it. A vast cohort that stretches back through time and stretches out across the globe, creating data and handing it on, debugging and optimizing algorithms for other people to use, critiquing ideas and sharpening analytical tools. You can look at the academic practice and the way we've deployed it in ancient studies and spatial studies as an ethic of care if you step away from the competition and the polemics and focus on the ways we're helping each other. The vast majority of projects on the conference schedule, and I think all of the ones that I could think of to talk about outside the conference schedule, are explicitly and immediately collaborative. Right? They don't just depend on all this past data and all this past software. They're all multi-authored papers. They are someone representing a team of multiple people. There's not a single lone scholar in a garret among them. And we look around this room, and we're going to find like-minded colleagues galore. We're going to see mentors and friends and helpers, comforters, makers, guardians, probably after a while some drinking buddies. We've also been building the community infrastructure we need to carry on caring about each other and about the work we do. This work that I like to characterize as explaining the human past to the human present and preserving that understanding for the human future. We have centers and conferences and special interest groups and training sessions. And if we approach these with care and use them with care, if we involve undergraduates carefully in research and work with interested people from outside the academy and respect them, if we have increasingly useful data sets and increasingly interconnected information systems that we take care of and help each other to use, we might get something. Will all of these artifices survive? Will every center be the same? Will every special interest group or whatever persist forever? No. I mean, lots of them will degrade, and we should take care to try to ensure they degrade gracefully. Another Novisky admonition. Graceful degradation. We get to play a big role. Not exclusively, it's not all up to us, but we do get to play a big role in deciding what and when and how the changes occur. So if there's a stable orbit to be found, I think it's in continuing to work together and doing so mindfully, acknowledging our debts to each other and repaying them in kind. I'm reminded of a conversation I had with Scott Madry. Scott's not here. No, Scott's not here. Scott Madry. This was back in the early aughts, and we were just getting the mapping center rolling. And Pleiades was just an idea. I think at this point, this was like, no, maybe we had gone beyond idea, but it didn't have a grant, that's for sure. As many of you know, Scott, together with Carol Crumley, who's on the faculty here, and numerous other collaborators, both here in Chapel Hill and beyond, they've been running a multidimensional research project in Burgundy since the 1970s, with a focus on landscape, historical landscape. And I think at one time or another, somebody in the Burgundy Historical Landscape Project has conducted most of the kinds of studies I've mentioned. And all the while, they've been husbanding this vast and growing store of spatial and other data and moving it across systems and formats, and talk about care and curation. And I think the conversation I'm remembering with Scott took place after he'd spent a couple of hours teaching undergraduate students in my seminar. I was doing this crazy thing on Roman roads and transportation. And Scott had consented to come in and spend a class teaching them how to do orthophoto analysis the old-fashioned way. So he had prints, stereo prints of orthophotos. We had the little stereoscope glasses on little stands. And he had the students all looking at these. And he was having them do the Sarah Paycak thing, looking for crop marks or other things that might indicate a potential buried piece of physical culture. And this was data from his study area. These were World War II vintage stereo photos of their study area. So that went great. The students loved it. After they'd gone, Scott and I were commiserating about the challenges of maintaining and funding long-running research projects. And at that point, I really didn't know what I was talking about. Scott really did. And he was trying to bootstrap himself out of, I think, feeling a little down about it. But I do remember very clearly what he said. He said, he was talking about him and Carol. He said, we were standing on that hill in Burgundy 20 years ago. We were looking around, and we'd run out of money. And I said, I don't know how we're going to do it, but we are eventually going to figure out what happened here. That's what